Welcome to installment number 2 of the Introduction to Art History exam reviews. I thought we'd do exactly the same thing we did last time, but we're going to mix it up a little bit at the end and do some drills and just look at works and, try to remember all the things we're supposed to remember about them. But first we'll cover the format, go back over my study tips, and then we'll run through all the key themes for the class sessions we've had. And, of course, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions as we go, because I'm sure I didn't capture everything. So it's 8 to 10 multiple choice questions this time. I think it's all pretty similar to what we did last time. 2 to 3 fill-in-the-blank questions. There'll be 2 to 3 short answer questions where you'll have to identify the works and then answer a question on the function, meaning, or historical context. Again, there'll be a handout that's just copies and then a blue book for those sorts of things. And then this time there'll be 2 essays. And in the essays, it'll be 2 to 4 works, and then you'll write the essay comparing a pair of the works. Again, it goes in the blue book, and we'll be dealing with compare and contrast, and then discussing the formal qualities like the form, the style, the function, just like the exercises we do in class, and relate it to the historical, cultural, and or religious context and audience. What's different this time, last time we gave you a thesis statement and you had to support the thesis statement. This time you will create your own thesis statement. So for both of those questions, make sure to take a few minutes at the very beginning to kind of jot down what you're thinking, what you remember, all that sort of thing. Use that to help you create the thesis sentence and then write your essay. Because I can tell you the people who took the time to do that last time around did way better on the essay questions than people who didn't. And remember last time I had those 3 or 4 stoplights on the essay question slides? I mixed it up a little bit this time because PowerPoint was not being helpful in making those things work properly. So it'll be one little timer that'll say 5 minutes for the brainstorming part. Then you'll have 15 minutes of just a plain slide with no timer, and then another timer will come up and give you the last 5 minutes. So you'll be able to kind of keep track of where you are in the time slot. Does that make sense? Okay. Each of the multiple choice questions should be pretty straightforward. We put in a minute for those. There'll be 2 minutes for each of the fill-in-the-blanks, 5 minutes for each of the short answers. And then another thing we're going to try differently this time is there'll be thumbnails running along the bottom of the PowerPoint. So you'll have the main image taking up most of the screen, but then the next sort of 8 to 10 questions will have little thumbnails at the bottom, so you can either work backwards or forwards. If you knocked off the question or you don't know the questions and you want to move on, you can. Then we already talked about 25 minutes for each essay, and then again we'll bring the blue books, and so all you need is a pen or 2 in case yours fails, and then you remember my little timer circles, I hope. Okay, it was apparent last time that people did not take me seriously when I said you actually have to memorize those stupid dates and so forth. You actually have to memorize all that stuff. It's really a drag. It doesn't take a lot of brain power. It just takes some time and just going over it over and over and over again so you can spit it back out and you make all sorts of points out of it. Not fun, but you got to do it. This time, dates need to be within the decade. So it's not good enough to say 16th century. You're going to have to say 1690 or whatever the right decade is. And then a little shortcut you can take is on the mediums this time, really just focus on the exceptions because a lot of the stuff was oil on canvas, and that's actually going to get even better next time. I mean, marble's pretty easy to identify, so pay attention to when it's like oil on wood or tempera on wood. Those are the kinds of exceptions you'll see more than anything else. Then review the cultural themes and main points. We'll go through some of that here in a minute. Go through your books, go through your notes as well as the book because those should complement each other pretty well. And then the word realistic is still off limits, but there's lots of other great vocabulary words you get a chance to use like sfumato and tenebrism and stuff like that. So make sure you are ready to sprinkle those liberally in your essays. Any questions or concerns there? All right, so we started out with the medieval period. Here we saw Christianity mixing with the heritage of the Greco-Roman empires, but also bringing in some elements of the cultures of the people from the north. Almost all of the patronage was by kings and churches. We saw a great deal of manuscript illumination. I think there were like 3 of the images are for manuscripts, and those involved complex ornamental designs to help elevate the material to a spiritual plane. We also saw the rise of large-scale sculpture, especially on the exterior of churches, and we moved into Romanesque style based on Rome. Mostly we saw that in church constructions, driven partly by pilgrimages, which also led to the reliquary phenomenon, and then it had the effect on the way the church was laid out. Are there any questions about the medieval period? Okay, I strongly recommend that you review this diagram and you know what all of those words mean. Might even be a good idea to make a copy without the words on it and go back and test yourself. Yes?
Can you go back to the last slide?
Sure.
When you say like Roman life, when you're talking about the pilgrimages and all of that stuff, like I don't remember how that was Roman like.
It was the church construction that was Roman-like. So we had those barrel vaults, and the use of the columns and the arches was very much echoing the way that they had been done in the Roman Empire. We saw the basilica structure emerge, and that came straight out of the way early Christian buildings were built, which in turn came out of the way Romans had built some of their government structures.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Is the next picture on our College?
I believe it is, but I can make a note to double check. Okay, anything else? I'm pretty sure you won't have to use the word absidioles, so you just stick with side chapels on that. Although it's kind of fun to say. Okay, then we move on to the Gothic period. We're still getting patronage through the church and rulers, but churches start to get taller, more light-filled, and more spacious. We have the pointed arch, so we evolved from that rounded arch that came pretty much straight from the Romans to one that could bear weight in a different way, which led to the ribbed groin vault, where we were able to put those X's up. That enabled us to put stained glass windows and add color to the church experience, but it required adding flying buttresses to the outside to hold all of the weight of the walls and the roof. And then somebody finally got smart and made space for the pilgrims to actually walk through the chapel and experience their holy moments in front of the relics, called the ambulatories. The other thing that happens in the Gothic period is we begin to see a return to naturalism. Remember we talked about, I think it was the reliquary Jean, the queen with the little baby? Sound familiar? Just a little piece of gold, gorgeous. Anyway, she had that Gothic sway to her, and we saw her look like a real person as opposed to some of the Marys that we see painted in the period. And we start to see some perspectival space show up as well. Questions about the Gothic? Okay. There's a rebirth of interest in antiquity and nature as a source. We start to see patronage moving outside of the church, outside of the religious sphere, and so that creates more freedom for both the artist and the patron, but then we also start to see political undertones creep into some of the art. It's still religious art by and large, but there are changes in the iconography, and we look less to Christ's divinity in these pictures than to evidence of his humanity. And we also start to see some references to classical philosophy. The figure treatment becomes much more realistic. It's more anatomical. We see actual weight and volume in the limbs and the shapes of the bodies. Here's one of our favorite words, chiaroscuro. Might want to sprinkle that into one of your essays at some point. And then the idea of the trompe l'oeil, where we, for example, had that ceiling oculus that created the illusion that the ceiling wasn't there and the building opened straight up into the sky. which was part of the integration of architecture and painting. So spaces became really treated fully with the way the space was built and the way the painting was executed. Oops. Any questions about the early Renaissance? Yes?
Can you define chiaroscuro?
Chiaroscuro?
Yeah.
It's the using of light and dark to give something shape and weight. So we'll look at a couple of images later on, and we can talk then about where we see chiaroscuro. I think the hardest part about chiaroscuro is that you learn about it at the same time you learn about tenebrism, and they're different. So tenebrism is really when you have that deep, dark background and it looks like somebody's thrown a spotlight on the figures in the painting. That is not chiaroscuro, that's tenebrism. Chiaroscuro is just being able to apply color, mixing in a little bit of the black, mixing in a little bit of the white, so that when you paint an arm, it looks round like an arm. So it's a much more subtle effect. Does that make sense? More sense? Okay, then High Renaissance. People really get going with some of these things. The patronage and artistic freedom continue to expand. The nude figure returns for the first time since the Roman Empire. We see non-biblical subject matter emerge, coming from both mythology and additional thoughts from classical philosophy. There are significant gains in modeling, perspective advances. This is when we see linear perspective get codified and written down, and also atmospheric perspective. And oil paint becomes a thing. So that enables people like Leonardo to do sfumato. And it also ignites this debate between the color people and the line people, so that Titian, Michelangelo contrast that we looked at in class. Questions about the High Renaissance? Yeah.
Sorry, I just have a lot of questions.
That's fine. It's what we're here for.
Okay, atmospheric perspective is just like the background looks fuzzy, right?
Yeah. So, you know when you're driving down the highway in West Texas and it gets really fuzzy off in the distance and it starts to look kind of hazy and kind of gray, and sometimes that's clouds, but sometimes that's just because the Earth is curving. You have to have a really, really amazingly clear day for that not to happen. So that's atmospheric perspective, incorporating that idea of that fuzziness and that blueness and the haze in the background to create the sense that what's actually on a plane in front of you is actually further off than it is. Yeah. Okay, Northern Renaissance. We get Martin Luther starting the Protestant Reformation. Do not forget this information. In the North, this reduces the patronage for art from the church, because one of the things he questions is why the church is spending so much money on art and not on its people. The middle class in these areas is becoming increasingly wealthy. There's also innovations in trade at the time, and they start buying art. So we start to see an increase in art of a secular nature. There's portraits and landscapes. And there is still art for churches, but it's very, very different than what we've been seeing in the Southern Renaissance. The other key difference in the Northern Renaissance is that they don't have a lot of classical sculpture to look at. So they get the naturalism part of it. They get being able to paint bodies, but there's not a lot of idealization. It is almost photographic to some extent, all the flaws that they'll capture in the image, in the people that they paint. They also develop a complex symbolism that's a little bit more extensive than what we see in the Italian peninsula. Any questions about the Northern Renaissance? And then things get really crazy with Mannerism. So it's sometimes a little intimidating to try to tell the difference between a Mannerist painting and a Renaissance or Baroque painting. If it looks really weird, call it Mannerist. Long necks, strange bodies, a lack of perspective or depth to the space, these are all characteristics of Mannerism style. It's artificial and not following nature. There's not a clear narrative. Bizarre, often sensual, esoteric imagery that requires decoding, and complex poses and busy compositions so that the patron and the artist can show off how clever they are by both painting it and being able to read it. Another great way to think about mannerism is to think about it in contrast to the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent, because this is the kind of stuff that they put an end to when we get to the Baroque. Before I do that, any questions about mannerism? Okay, then we get to the Baroque. The Catholic Church in Rome gets its act together and says, we got to do something about this Luther guy. We have the Counter-Reformation that's really centered on the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent comes back and it says, the Pope is the authority, the Roman Church is the only way, the saints still have value. And art is an appropriate tool for us to use because it shows the power of the church, of spirituality, and it allows us to communicate with our constituents who don't necessarily know how to read. So it helps to promote morality and good behavior on their part. However, no more of this mannerist crazy stuff. We want clear, legible, accurate art. It's got to have appropriate messages. It's got to be decorous, I don't know how to say that word, and stimulate piety. It's got to show that it's serving the purposes that we think that art ought to serve. And it has to be emotionally appealing. So you do see more dramatic painting at this point and heightened emotion versus, say, the Renaissance period. This is when we get the tenebrism, where the light comes into the painting and really makes a striking statement about which figures are important. You'll see lots of diagonals and unbalanced compositions. Things become asymmetric. There'll be movement and then, and in some cases, an even more elaborate integration with architecture. One other thing we saw in the Baroque period was our first female artist, and that was an opportunity for us to talk about feminism and psychoanalysis in the context of art. Just to be clear, this is not the only time we get to talk about psychoanalysis and art, but it may be the only time in this class because it is such a fast ride through all of art history. Questions about the Baroque? Okay, then we move into the 18th century and Rococo painting. Rococo, to me, is kind of a continuation of a lot of what we saw happening in the Baroque in terms of the way lines are used and forms are very emotional. But the dynamics behind the art market have changed completely. So the absolute monarchy in France has tried to control art through the Academy and through its patronage of the arts. But we also have aristocrats kind of pushing back against that, and they're buying the art and allowing some innovation to happen. So the subjects that you'll see in Rococo art include basically fun things that rich people do. So there's no heroic moments. There's a lot of beauty and love as central themes. The landscapes become quite idyllic, but include some uncontrolled nature. You have coded sexual messages, pervasive light makes the forms kind of dissolve. So that's, again, that effect of sfumato, but it's coming from a different kind of technique. Organic forms, and this is where we start to think about the word painterly, where you really see the paint being applied to the canvas. The other thing that happens in the Rococo a little later on is the Enlightenment. So that includes focus on observation and reason, empiricism. The scientific method comes out of the Enlightenment period. Emotions are still valid as a source of knowledge. And we start to think about secular individual moral responsibility as opposed to that which is dictated to you by your membership in a church. Another key Enlightenment theme is the inherent equality of individuals and the social contract between the people and the government. It does not have a lot of effect on Rococo art, but boy, does it have an effect when we get to the neoclassical period. But it's not just about Fragonard and his swing. It also encompasses the sensibility pictures that Chardin painted and the satire that we saw from Hogarth. Questions about the Rococo or the 18th century? All right, then we wrapped it up Thursday with the neoclassical period. We have the French Revolution, coming in part from the feeling that that contract between the government and its people has broken. The monarchy falls and Napoleon comes to power. Art becomes highly politicized and about sending a moral message to the population. This is where we had the question earlier about the Cupid seller. A lot of what painting tries to do is teach, have a didactic purpose, instruct people as to moral behavior, but whimsy doesn't die. There are still painters out there who are having a little bit of fun with the themes. And we really start to see a gender complementarity evolve at this point. So women and men are depicted in very different ways in these paintings. They're quite stylistically, they're restrained, they're very tight. There'll be not a lot of depth to the frame. There's no shimmering light. What was fun in the Rococo now becomes what was focused on as fun in the Rococo is rejected, and we look at more intellectual and moral pursuits. We're interested in antiquity and the Renaissance. This is sort of the second wave of looking back to Rome. Perspective and chiaroscuro emerge again, and we get the linear technique as opposed to the painterly that we talked about in the Rococo. Questions on the neoclassical period? Okay. Drills. What is this? I have to get my cheat sheet out. Where did we see it? What period did we see it in? Very good. Where was it? Close. Got the right country. And it is a cathedral. This one came from Chartres, a little bit outside of Paris. Do you remember what kinds of things are depicted in the stained glass? Okay, let's go back to our key themes on Gothic. Who's the likely patron here? But also the monarchy. So when they commission this window, we get some subtle indications of the monarchy within the composition. So for example, I don't have a pointer, of course. You see in the small vertical bits that are supporting the base of the large circular window, those are fleurs-de-lis, which are symbols of the King of France. The little castles that are next to it I think they're symbols of his wife's family, but the point is there's imagery contained within this window that reflects both the patronage and the importance of messages of the church and also of the monarchy under which the church is built. Questions about this one? The name, if you were to do an ID, would be Rose Window and Lancets. And that's Lancets. And that refers to these vertical pieces at the bottom. This is the rose. These are the lancets. The lancets are these long things down here. Yeah. So if you were to write a short answer that was asking you why this was important in the Gothic period, what kinds of things would you say? We just talked about this. You can't have forgotten already. Right? It was an opportunity for both of them to show off their power. Yep. Yep. What does it tell us about the space that it was decorating. And we weren't able to put stained glass windows in before we learned how to build what? Yes.
Those things.
Right. You got to know the name of those things.
Hold
Very good.
on. Was it?
Buttresses. Yeah. So how do you remember that? Well, I guess they kind of come flying out of the building, so that part's easy. And then, maybe you think about how you might lean against something to shore it up. That's your buttress. I'm trying here. Okay. Let's see. What else do we have? What's this? Yeah. Very good, but you're close. One of the other manuscripts that we looked at was the book, An Image of Matthew. I don't remember, actually. I think all you have to get right is chi, rho, iota page, and you're good. Where did it come from? What culture? Yep. What part of the world? Mm-hmm. I think it's the only thing we've looked at, and probably will look at this entire course that came out of Ireland. So you can remember that, surely. Because it's March, right? We just had St. Patrick's Day. What does this tell us about the Gothic period? I'm sorry, the medieval period.
A lot of people were illiterate, but it didn't matter because they could still see that there's beauty without having to be able to read.
Very good. Anything else? Yeah.
Like showing the ornateness and like richness of the church.
So that helped transform this from being something that's normal and ordinary to what?
Kind of extravagant. It was like
There you go. I can't imagine. I mean, these guys were working with pen and ink and like fine little brushes. I cannot imagine executing this because you screw up one. They didn't have whiteout, and you had to go kill another sheep to get the vellum to paint this on. I mean, it really blows my mind that they were able to do it. Yeah.
Was that every page like that, or is that like a cover page?
The Book of Kells, as I understand it, I have never had the privilege of looking at it, is incredibly ornate and has quite a few pages that are this elaborate, but not every page. There are other manuscripts where just like the first letter will be really ornate, and they'll do that through several pages. So I'm sure it had something to do with who had the money and how many monks they could pay to decorate pages. But there was also that sort of Zen aspect to it, I guess, where the monks would this was their spiritual devotion, their kind of moment of giving back to the church. And so they had that kind of experience in making them as well. It's pretty interesting how these things get put together. So this is one of our exceptions. It's tempera on vellum. Vellum is a form of animal skin. I don't know that you'll need to know that, but it would be one of the exceptions to your basic oil on canvas work. Is this what I was trying to think of earlier? No, I was thinking about another reliquary. Who's this guy?
reliquary Saint Paul.
Yay! Very good. Reliquary of Saint Foy, which means faith. So you could also go with the English on that if you want. What period is this from?
Romanesque.
Yep. How do you know that? Yeah,
Like all of the reliquaries were from the Romanesque period.
pretty much. I think there was one that was Gothic. Oh, yeah, the one with the Madonna doing this. Yeah. Any questions or concerns about reliquaries? They seem to be pretty straightforward to me. Yeah.
Do we have to know what's in it?
No.
Okay.
No. You might need to know, like, it contains a remnant of a saint's body kind of thing, but nothing more specific than that. It's his left pinky finger. All right, we're going to get big now. How about these guys?
Gates of Paradise.
Yep. Where are they?
Isn't it the baptistry of San Giovanni in Florence? Is that it?
It is the baptistry in Florence. I don't recognize the
San Giovanni.
San Giovanni part, but that doesn't mean... Oh, wait, it's right here. Yes, it's from San Giovanni. Thank you. What period is it from?
Renaissance.
Early or late?
Early.
Good. Anybody want to take a guess at what it's made out of, what the medium is?
Bronze.
But there's something else going on with the bronze.
Gilded.
Yes, exactly. I think either of those answers is fine. Yeah.
Can you talk about what's going on in the pictures?
So we only really worked on one of the pictures, and I did not bring in the close-up. I didn't bring in the close-up. But they are scenes from the Bible.
Is this one where like the story starts from the bottom?
Yeah,
Leads?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the one that we talked about in depth was that middle one on the left. You see sort of the arches happening. That's the story of Jacob and Esau. And how mess up my Bible stories all the time. I think it was Esau. Jacob took over Esau's heritage by pretending to be Esau and fooling his father, and it was all very sad. But I think that if you had to talk about that in an essay or something, the very particular details of the story are less important than the layering of perspective and how much he has managed to incorporate both the depth of the buildings as well as the detail of the figures in telling the story. And he put basically the entire story on one panel through different little vignettes in that space. And of course, it's a story from the Old Testament. Yeah.
Were these the doors that were like molded in one piece?
You're thinking about the same artist, and the one that we I think this was also molded in one piece, but the one that we specifically talked about in class was the door that was done before this, which was a different side of the same building. And he won the contest in part because his was molded in one piece, whereas the other guy made his out of a bunch of little pieces. And so the judges felt like because it was molded in one piece, it would be faster to get the doors done than by making all these little pieces and having to glue them all together. Yeah. So same period for sure. Other questions about the doors? Okay. How about this one? Not kidding, you got to memorize this stuff.
Is it like laminate or lamentation?
No, this one is the Mantegna's Camera Picta at the Ducal Palace in Mantua. Remember, they had that whole room that was done in like all these incredible scenes of the family. And I can't remember, I think there may be one other scene from that that's in the PowerPoints that you have to memorize, and then this one. So there's two images from that palace. What?
What's this like the whole like looking up and like it looking like it's extending the space? What was that called?
The trompe l'oeil.
Oh.
Yeah. And if you can't spell that, don't worry about it. Just put in fooling the eye. Just put it in quotes so we know that you know that's what you're talking about.
Called the what?
Fooling the eye. Trompe l'oeil. It means tricking the eye. But it would have been, I mean, it would have been, it still is up at the ceiling, and it really creates this sense of opening up the space. So this is when we were talking about the the early Renaissance, and starting to integrate architecture and painting. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. Is it a strictly biblical scene? This is also where we start to see some of the secular art, some references to mythology, classical mythology coming in. I just noticed something I don't think I've seen before. I believe there's an African man in the image, which is really quite unusual for this period. I wonder how he fit into the whole ducal program. Questions about this one? What material, what's the medium on this? Yes.
What's it called again?
Fresco, Fresco, just like the soft drink, but with a 0 at the end. I mean an O instead of an A. Oh, I'm sorry, the name of the painting, Camera Picta. So camera like photograph, and then Picta is Picta. Okay, how about this one?
Dawn in the Meadows.
Remember who painted it? Isn't Raphael one of the Ninja Turtles? So remember those guys' names, because we have a sculpture by Donatello. We've got a couple of paintings by Michelangelo. We've got Raphael, and who's the fourth one? Wasn't there a fourth one? Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo maybe was the fourth one. Yeah, and then we have a couple of Leonardos. So just bring those guys with you when you come. Go watch a couple of cartoons tonight. Let's see. What period would you say this is? Which half? High, right. So when you answer Renaissance, you need to be able to say early, northern, or high. Early, high, northern, whatever. What kind of perspective is he using?
Atmosphere.
How do you know that? Very good. Not a lot of linear stuff going on here. Nope.
Explain linear more.
So linear perspective is that stuff that looks really mathematical. Do I have one? Not really. I mean, I guess the closest we have here is on this door, where you can see how the archways in that middle panel are kind of diving in together, and you could actually take a lot of pencil and draw, back to a perspective point, because everything gets connected. It looks really structured when you're looking at linear perspective. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Think again about that West Texas road going to a point at the end. When you see that on a painting, that's a linear perspective.
So like that one picture, I don't know if that painting is going to be on the tester. I know we went over it. I think it's like Christ on a cross, and the guys, a few of his disciples.
Yes.
And above it, archway.
At archway, yeah,
Mathematical, I guess.
that's super linear perspective. Yeah. This is a great place to look at chiaroscuro and think about it. You see, for example, that baby's butt. That's an example of using that light and dark to give you the sense of shape and curvature and weight. Is that making more sense? Oh, what else should we think about with this one? Would you say he's using sfumato? Or not?
What is that again?
Sfumato is the technique where you create such fine transitions between the different layers of the painting that you almost can't tell that there's a transition. And it comes about because of the invention of oil paint. People are able to create that nuanced layering.
You mean like how the background is like a different space from the foreground?
Uh-huh.
I would say no.
I think I'm with you. I mean,
It
it's...
doesn't look like much separation from her to the meadow and
she's very distinct from her background. So the classic piece that you think about sfumato in is the Mona Lisa, where her hair and her chin, like they all kind of blend together, because that's the way Leonardo was able to create the image of her face. However, I want to be very clear about something like this. If you're asked a question and you think the answer is no, then say why, because I can see her head clearly outlined against the sky. Or if you want to say yes, then you say maybe you want to focus on these shadows down here at the front, where I would say there is a little bit more of a sfumato effect. So just be prepared to support, your position. That's one of the nice things about art history, is you get to have an opinion as long as you can provide reasonable support for it.
So sfumato is whenever it's like flat or when it's not flat?
So sfumato, a picture probably wouldn't have sfumato, would not be called sfumato if there weren't some kind of modeling going on. So you need to be able to see the roundness of the face or the shadow of the chin or something like that. It's the distinction or the transitions that are taking place between one form and another that determine whether or not it's sfumato. So it's almost like the person who's painting it has kind of roughed up the lines, and there's not a clear edge, so to speak, between the hair and the sky, for example. Is that making more sense? Mm-hmm. Just go back in your mind's eye to the Mona Lisa. She's our poster child for the sfumato. Really kind of anything Leonardo did has got a lot of sfumato, except you can't really see it in The Last Supper so much. The Last Supper is another good one to think about when you're thinking about linear perspective, right? Because you've got that ceiling that comes in, and then it all kind of points at Christ's head. So,
what painterly is that more like that one self-portrait? I forgot who it was that did the self-portrait, but it's very like,
Rembrandt, yeah,
Rembrandt. You can see like his every stroke, like you can tell he painted it. Like,
yeah,
very photographic.
exactly.
And
That's painterly, right? And then the linear style is much stronger than that. And we talk about it as though they're two completely separate things, but there's just like everything else we talk about, there's a continuum. So you'd put, Rembrandt way over here, you'd put Michelangelo way over here, and I think you'd put, Raphael kind of this direction, but not totally, because you can still see sort of some of the, particularly in the texture of the landscape, you can see some of those painterly strokes. Yeah. Again, this is Raphael. Those answers are all right as long as you can support them. All right, what else? Where'd this one come from?
It's like something in Ghent.
Yep.
It's the Ghent altarpiece.
There you go. What's different about this and what we might see in an altarpiece in Italy? No, we'd have altarpieces that open in Italy too. The subject matter is pretty different, particularly in the scenario at the bottom with the lambs and so forth. It gets a little weird, but also in the inclusion of the two patrons here on the outside. Any guesses when this was done? It is Renaissance. But it's from the Northern Renaissance. Yeah. And it was done before Luther raised a ruckus. So we're still in churches and we're still spending big money on big art. It's really, it's terrible to look at this thing on a slide because it is quite magnificent and quite large. Like I'd say twice as big as that image shows up on the screen. It's really incredible. This is Jan van Eyck, E-Y-C-K. His name is not fun to spell. E-Y-C-K. Yeah, Jan, J-A-N, and then Van, V-A-N. All right, this next one is crazy. What period do you think this one's from? Keep going. A little later. Does it look particularly... yeah, we're way past Donatello. He's dead. Yep. Does it look particularly inspired by Roman statues? I mean, certainly they got the figure. They picked up on the figure. And perhaps you might say the emotion of the Laocoon is showing up here. But we're well past the Renaissance at this point. When did we see a lot of emotion coming back into art? Just before Rococo. Baroque. So this is Baroque, and it's Bernini. And I don't know if any of y'all were with my group at the Kimball when we talked about how you remember Bernini is the Baroque guy, but they both have R's in them. I know, it's crazy. Otherwise, you get him mixed up with the other guy whose name I'm not going to say, because then you'll think of him. So the only one to memorize for this exam is Bernini. Right. And we didn't talk about this very much with this piece, but it is another example of how art was integrated with the architecture. As you can kind of see how it floats in front of the wall, and you get that really incredible three-dimensional feeling. A lot of emotion, a lot of movement. What else did we say about the Baroque period? Asymmetric, diagonals, unbalanced, all of those things you can see in the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. All right, what's up with this one?
All I remember about it is it was going to be the Last Supper, but he renamed it because he didn't want to repaint it.
And why was he told that he had to repaint it?
Because it's part of whatever reform thing.
Very good.
What is it called?
The people who were in charge of the Counter-Reformation
Counter-Reformation, yeah. They didn't like it.
said it,
It didn't depict the actual story correctly. So
right.
he made it,
So it was not accurate?
yeah, he
Yep.
made the other story.
Yep.
All the disciples and Jesus are having dinner with like publicans and like high tax officials and stuff. I forgot what it's called.
It's called Feast in the House of Levi. But definitely not the Last Supper. Here we have another good example to remember when you want to think about. This one actually shows a little bit of atmospheric perspective as well as linear perspective, but I would say the linear perspective dominates. But you see, for example, the lines on the floor converging, and then a little bit of cloud cover in the background to give you that atmospheric sense.
You said Feast of Levi?
The Feast in the House of Levi, just like the jeans. So because it's got the response to the Counter-Reformation, you know the date is going to be after 1550, right? That's one of the ways you can kind of sort things into piles to help memorize some of the dates. All right, keeping with the architectural theme, what period would you say this is?
Rococo.
Yes, indeedy. What makes you think it's Rococo?
Because it's really like ornate within the gold at the top and the walls.
Totally over the top. And one of the key things that we talked about in class was the irregular shapes of the spaces where the paintings are. So if you can't find anything else that tells you it's Rococo, you've got that. Lots of tendrils and leaves and shells and all sorts of little natural things scattered here and there. There was one other thing about this room that we talked about in class that was important. Do you remember? Yeah.
I know it's called a salon. It was meant for like entertaining people, but I don't know if that's a
It's oval. Yep. And so it was meant to be an intimate conversational space. And we contrasted it with that hall of mirrors at Versailles, which goes on and on and on and on. All right, so something completely different now. This is really about the worst picture I've seen of this painting, but that's what we got. So do you remember what it is? This was an example of the satire we talked about in the 18th century. Yeah, exactly. Do you remember who the artist is? This is Hogarth, Hogarth. He was quite well known for his nasty little commentaries on life in the big city. Okay, one more. Hang in there. What period is this? And if you get this wrong, I'm going to kill you. Yay! Why is it neoclassical? There you go. First clue.
It's like taking stuff from like Roman times, but it's like in a new setting almost.
I mean, how could it not be neoclassical? It's either classical, it's either from Rome, or it was painted more recently. You got the column, she's dressed like a Roman matron, she's got, the story is coming out of Roman mythology, so everything about this painting says neoclassical. It gives us the moral message that we were looking for with neoclassical painting. It gives us the intimate setting. Remember, we talked about how a lot of neoclassical works will become very shallow in their settings. And yet we also have that little moment of whimsy that Dr. Fripp talked about with the little girl that's playing with the jewelry that she's not supposed to be playing with. Very clear gendered message about the mother taking care of her children, a very clear moral message about, not wanting to be a consumer, to just be a good family person, etc.
Did you say that C word again? Chiaroscuro?
Chiaroscuro.
Chiaroscuro?
Yes.
Does it have that? Because it seems
Yeah, I would say it does. So take a look, for example, at Cornelia's arm that's curving down. You see how it's slightly darker and shaded on the underside. Yep. I would not call this a tenebrist. I don't think we looked at anything I would call a tenebrist painting, where we got that really strong spotlight effect, because the light's more evenly distributed across the figures here.
That would be the one with the bird that they're like taking the oxygen away from, right?
That would be a tenebrist painting. Yeah.
What about the tomb one? Where they're putting Jesus into?
Yes.
And it's blacked out on the back. So
Yes. Yeah. Anytime you can't really see what's going on in the background, you take a pretty good shot at calling it a tenebrist painting. Yeah. All right. So that's all I've got for drills. I'm going to open up for questions in the last 5 minutes. What are you guys wondering about or not sure about? Yeah.
Can you kind of talk a little bit about the Council of Trent? Because it just kind of trips me up a little bit. I don't really understand it very well.
Okay. So let me just preface my remarks by saying I'm a little bit jaded about this whole period in the history of the world. So if I say something really nasty and sarcastic, I'm not meaning to offend you. It's just the way I kind of process this information. So we have the Catholic Church in Europe that is really owning everything. I mean, they own territory. They own your spiritual life. They are selling indulgences. They are asking you to give them money so that you can go to heaven. It becomes really, in my opinion, fairly disgusting in terms of like what a church is supposed to exist to do. So Martin Luther finally, I'm sure there are other people who are talking about it, Martin Luther gets brave enough to do something about it, and he writes up his 95 reasons why the church sucks, and he goes up to the door of the university and he hammers his 95 reasons up to the door. That's the Reformation. That's the Protestant Reformation, the start of it. Well, at first, the Catholic Church in Rome says, he's just kind of a kook. We'll let it, it'll all blow over soon. But it turns out it didn't blow over soon. People started to get momentum behind Luther, and a lot of membership in the church switched loyalties, including, for example, the King of England. That'll get your attention. So the powers that be, the Pope, the cardinals, and whoever else got invited to this, said, well, we got to sit down together and figure out what we're going to do about it. And that was the Council of Trent. And essentially, the Council of Trent met for 3 years off and on, 3 or 4 years off and on, and they went through all of the complaints that Luther posted, and they said, maybe we should fix that one. Or they said, no, that's absolutely wrong. This is how the world works. I'm the Pope, I'm infallible, and I'm going to issue a decree to that effect. One of which was this one about art, where we still need art, because Luther said art's a waste of time and money. You should just be looking at the Bible for your spiritual guidance. And the Pope said, no, we need art. We need art to show that we belong in people's lives, that we're important, that and as a way to communicate with people who can't read the Bible. So they went through all the 95 complaints, and they came up with their sort of program to address them. So when you talk about things that the church did after the Council of Trent, people got really strict. Like the whole church hierarchy got really strict about how things had to be, which is why that painting that was called The Last Supper had to be renamed, because they're really concerned about the impact that the Protestant Reformation is having on church membership and church loyalty. So the Council of Trent was all about trying to not so much fix the things that were broken, but certainly to get people back into the fold. Does that make more sense?
Yes.
Was that way more than you had in mind? Okay. Yeah,
So for the 2 essays, do you have 25 minutes total or 25 minutes for each?
25 minutes for each.
Okay.
So we'll race through those multiple choice and fill in the blanks pretty fast, and then let you get your teeth sunk into the essays. And they both start with identifications, as they did last time. So, all right, well, I'm done talking if you guys are done asking questions. So I will see some of you at the Kimball tomorrow, and if not, I'll see you all here on Thursday.